thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a bigger audience than what I expected, but we're really excited to see you all. I'm Melissa Moore from Lean Startup Company. First, I want to do a check with the audience. How many of you are here working for a startup right now? How many work for an enterprise company? Okay, good, so there's a good mix. And how many of you work in a remote or distributed team? Okay, good mix. Terrific. So it's an honor for me to be in this panel with Pearson of Upwork. We have CeCe Cheng of Andela and Karla Monterroso of Code 2040. Thank you, guys. So I just want to kick off this discussion by asking my panelists, why is this topic important to you? The title of this session is called The Future of the Workplace, Diversity and Inclusion. So maybe each of you could share just 1 to 2 sentences about why this is a big topic for you personally.
I think that's good. I grew up in a low-income community. It was first my family to go to college, and have watched very much the difficulties for the people around me in getting there. And I just think America is different now, right? Like, it was a very homogenous workforce for a long time, and this is the first time where you're seeing 36% of the workforce be people of color, 50% of it be women. LGBTQA are out for the first time in major cities. We are in a globalized economy, and all of our systems, whether they be educational or economic, were geared to a much more homogenized, stabilized set of things. And now we are in a rapidly evolving, and globalized, diverse workforce. And if we're not training our workforce how to make the leaps in the competencies they need to get there, then we're going to be disadvantaged in our economy.
So 10 years ago, I hired my first remote worker, and 3 companies later, I now work for a company that tries to make this a reality for companies of all sizes. And I've seen not only the secret weapon that it can be for these companies, but also the inclusion of other cultures has been a fantastic thing for our company, and has really started to attract the right type of talent that at least I want to work with.
So my startup is called Andela, and we are a technical leadership program for software engineers in Africa. So for us, the company was founded on the belief that while intelligence and drive and ambition is equally distributed, opportunity is not. And so for me, it's both about why distributed makes your team stronger, but then also the fact that there are large populations of qualified people out there who would love the opportunity to work with you. And so how do you find them?
Terrific. So as more and more companies become global and remote, what are some of the changes that you're seeing as you're hiring team members?
I'll start. I think one is your pipeline. Where are you looking? If you recruit from the same universities over and over again, then your workforce might start to look a little more homogenous. If you start to think broader about where to find talent, if you look at your interview process and make sure that you don't have questions that a certain demographic might be able to answer better, not because of any qualification, but just because of the culture they grew up in or the society that they're used to. So I would say pipeline and process.
And Upwork is a company that allows other businesses to hire freelancers and businesses and freelancers to connect. So we're drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit here, but we have 200 full-time employees and 800 freelancers who are working with us full-time. And every new job or project that we open, we look to our freelance workforce first. And we currently have freelancers in 75 countries working for us, 180 that any of you could hire, 180 countries. So what it's changed for us is realizing, particularly when you live in the bubble that we have here in the Bay Area, the amount of talent that is out there, and that the best talent isn't within the 4 walls of your company. It's more likely to be outside in some obscure postal code, and they're eager to work for you and often more loyal than your regular employees.
I mean, co-sign on both of those things. I also think we're in a transition where people have come into an office and worked this 9-to-5 job, and now the variety of hours that they're working, the things that they're working on means that you have whole people in an office or even remote. And it means you have to get much better at the change management that comes along with having whole people at the table that do not operate well in hierarchical structures where, which is not a knock on hierarchy, but a command structure versus an investment structure, I think is becoming a lot more difficult for folks.
Great. And can you give us specific examples on how we can develop that culture of diversity and inclusion with this new way of working? You know, as we work with more remote team members, freelancers, how do we intentionally build a culture that supports that?
Yeah, I think a company developing its organization values is really important because you want diversity everywhere else, and you want a couple of cultural markers that you've put your foot in the ground of like, actually, this is what we want here in the way, and that those values are not just like, oh, we believe in diversity, or they are like how you come, like what you do is your goals and how you do it is your values, and then are able to use that within a management structure in really effective ways and make really tough choices about that. Like I know even at Code 2040, like we went from last year we were 11 people, we're 25 people, we're in a really like a live set of conversations right now, and we've had to make really tough decisions like what companies are we involved with that we're actually no longer going to partner with because they're not ready, and those kinds of decisions have to point back to us. Woo! I upset someone quite a bit. And those decisions have to point back to a set of like cultural markers everyone has signed up for, and not just a like, hey, here's what my leader says we need to do.
I have a pretty short answer to this one, and it's just what we found in working and scaling remote teams is it starts with respect, and then your team will recognize from when you schedule meetings, including them in every all hands, including them in the information that you're sending to your employees, breeds a culture that embraces those who are not in your office and may be much different than you.
Agree with all of that. I would just add that just like anything else, I think it's important to set people up for success. So if you have a remote team, making sure that they're included with all of the meetups, with all of the stand-ups, that's important. But then also just making sure that you have strong communication in general across the board, across your company. When you think about when startups scale and things break, really a lot of it comes down to communication. The way that you communicate with people when they're in a room and there's 5 people versus 2 floors versus 2 offices, it's not that different than from San Francisco to Nairobi or San Francisco to New York. And so if you're setting in, if you bake that into your culture, a culture of being communicative, a culture of recording conversations, a culture of being flexible with meetings. If you have someone that is taking time off from work, whether they have a child or they move to Denver and you want to keep them in your workforce, I think that thinking strategically about that from early on helps.
So we run this training at Code 2040 for companies from time to time of how to have tough conversations about race or that involve race. And we go through the neuroscience of what happens and people going into fight, flight, or freeze whenever they're in that conversation, getting really self-protective. It's all reactive thinking often. And it never fails that when I'm in a company doing this training that it devolves into a poor feedback culture that people have. So they will be telling each other and giving each other feedback, and something that is racially coded or biased, like, oh, you were being really aggressive or you were being really differential, does not give someone anything that can help them transition into being a good or better employee, and if only pigeonholes them within stereotypes about their own race and ethnicity, right? So you're teaching people how to actually be people together in a culture that has not actually set them up for that in any of their systems.
Great. And just taking a step back, Karla, can you explain to us the difference of diversity versus inclusion? Because I know people confuse the two all the time, and it's usually like hand in hand, but maybe you could clarify more on that.
Yeah, I guess my favorite metaphor for this or parallel analogy for it is that diversity is sending everyone an invite to your party, and inclusion is everyone understanding that they are a valued person, you want to be there, and how they walk in as a result, right? So like you've been a person who has walked into a room where you're like, oh God, I'm gonna have to deal with a thing, right? And I think equally, I've done a lot of training around setting people up for like white people being in a conversation around ethnic and racial diversity, and the amount of fear that's there because of the repercussions that are there for white people if they participate and mess up. And so I take extra pains in those conversations for like, how do I set you up for that? This is what it's going to look like. Here are the places where I think your thoughts are going to be most important. Let me process you through what you're going to do, all to get them to be active participants in the conversation in the first place. And I am equally working in a world where a lot of the people of color that I'm helping put into the workforce do not have that kind of consideration applied to them, right? And so we do an equation at Code 2040 around resources over risk intensity equals like a thriving employee. And the more risk that people feel being at a table, the less product that you are going to be able to get out of them, the less of their ideas you're going to be able to get out of them. So how do you foster an environment that like brings everyone in?
Great. And because we're here at Lean Startup Week, what have you personally learned from the Lean Startup methodology that affects how you work internally in this new style, in our new, remote or being culturally diverse and inclusive?
Yeah, I'll pass this along. So I think people go real dumb when it comes to inclusion. Like all of these really like smart people who would measure, who build, measure, learn, stop doing that when it comes to areas of inclusion, right? Like it is like, oh, we're doing a training on implicit bias, and that is supposed to fix the thing. And it does not honor all of the other ways. Like this isn't a feelings problem. This is an operations, systems, policies, and management behavior problem. And thus applying the Lean Startup methodologies to it is really important.
Terrific.
Yeah, I'd concur. Having been 3-person companies and now multiple hundreds, the MVP is common parlance at our company. And as an example, we recently launched Upwork Pro, which is meant to be a top 1% of developers, designers that you can come hire. And we did that with Salesforce forums, and we didn't really build much product because we wanted to understand. And then once we got those insights and had a couple pivots along the way, or mini pivots at least, to apply what we thought would work and what ended up working, that has been it's kind of ingrained in our culture and is a great thing.
Something that we're doing right now is looking at what the market needs when it comes to developer talents. Is it Python, is it iOS, is it Android? And making sure that as we train our developers for future careers, that we're listening very closely to what the market needs at the moment.
Great. And I think that because we have 50% startups here and 50% enterprise, I would like to ask, what can large organizations learn from startups in this new way of working and vice versa? I don't know if you guys have opinions, or we can also ask the audience if you guys have thoughts and what is happening in your company that is going well, and what can other companies learn from you guys? I don't know if you guys want to start it.
I think what large companies can learn from small is there can be innovation anywhere. I've met with a lot of colleagues, friends who are like, I work at large company X, and boy, I have kind of startup envy. But you can do, and often you can do a lot more within a large company by creating innovative groups. And we have, there's more innovation with remote teams coming out of Procter & Gamble than some of our smaller startups who are clients. So that's interesting to me. I think from a large company, or what small and startups can learn from large companies is process is not always a bad thing. And as you start to scale and try to scale and have repeatable success, I know I'm one who will always just try to figure it out, and we can figure out how to scale. And that's bitten me in the rear end a few times by not pausing as we're starting to scale and thinking about the processes that are needed to really make this one insight or this one win really impact the business. And so I think large companies do that a little better. And so blending the two is probably a good thing.
I think startups are often in the business of ecosystem building. Like, you have to get your product out there, you have to build a set of people that are engaged with that product, and you are going from place to place to build kind of that fanship. And I think once a larger company gets to where it is, it's like, oh, we have our ecosystem. And actually, I think inclusion requires you to build new ecosystems to connect and engage in ways that don't always have an immediate payoff. And I think startups get that pretty fundamentally because of the nature of the building a business. I will co-sign the process piece on, and also anything that is explicit, is good for everyone. Anything that is implicit will always disenfranchise underrepresented people at your company. Unintentionally, right? And people are able to innovate on top of that process in a lot easier ways than they are able to innovate should you have no process.
Okay. And I don't know if anyone here wants to share their story. No pressure. But if you would like to, just wave your hand. Sure. Do you want a mic? I'll just move this right here.
So I can just speak more on trends. So I worked for a startup in its infancy that many of you guys probably know, which is Grubhub, until it went public when I left, when it was very much siloed. And so I worked through a lot of our acquisitions, we used a lot of the lean methodology. Once it became siloed, they stopped it. And then through organizational polarities, now they're using it again and they're doing very well. And so I think you'll see that a lot through kind of innovation within the company. And I think that's kind of a trend once companies get big, which is why kind of talking about Procter & Gamble and how creative they're being, it's more out of necessity. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So we in our company we have 3 locations, 2 in US, 1 in India. What I observe people talk about, values, that values are easier to articulate if you're in the same location, because not only each location becomes an island, so they have different values, but if you articulate values, the words and the phrases you use in US and Silicon Valley are they're very different, they mean different things to someone sitting in India. So how do you articulate shared values for this distributed team in a way that is actually meaningfully shared rather than just words which mean different things to different people in respect?
I'm going to repeat that so the camera takes that question. But you were saying that in a company with 3 locations, how do you translate values and localize that? Did I get that right, more or less? Feel free.
I think that's a great question. I think that one thing that we've seen companies do that's been successful, WordPress, for example, is completely distributed, but they do have annual meetups where everyone congregates in one place. Andela is a distributed model. We place our software engineers stay and work out of Nairobi and Lagos, but when we place them with the new clients, we fly them to that headquarters for 2 weeks of onboarding in person. And so I think that there is the combination of online and offline. When you're communicating some of those things that are a little harder to do in a distributed model. But I think that that's a question that a lot of distributed teams are faced with, and I don't have a cookie cutter answer for that one.
I don't have a cookie cutter answer either. I think the respect that I meant was just in the actions that we try to do in order to ingratiate our teams and include them. I mean, that ranges from, and it bubbled up in different functional groups. An example, we have a completely distributed PR team. They have a social happy hour where all the people get on a hangout, and it's all about building that social thread between each other. They also will meet up on an annual or a semi-annual basis just to build that face-to-face, which isn't possible for every company. 2 companies that I think do it really well locally, in addition to Automatic, I think Thumbtack has made distributed teams. If you haven't looked at what they're doing and how they've integrated into their operations, you should. I forgot the name of the company. Anyway, for what Upwork will do is really try to think of those social, rather than the tendency is just to have the blinders on and you're talking to your remote team about this particular tasks, bringing them into kind of more your cultural events like the all hands, celebrating with them, including them in almost everything, and making sure that it's bi-directional, not just one way would be the one that I said. Zendesk is the other company that I was thinking about. They have 7 remote development teams and do an amazing job in integrating those development teams together. So I really look to them as well.
I'd say folklore is really important. I think while words sometimes don't translate, stories really do. And the way that people see the value play out. And if you can point to, in particular, really pivotal moments in the history of the company where that value really ended up determining an important decision, and bullet point for people the ways in which that plays out in day-to-day work, then I think that is a lot more accessible to folks than like, we value trust, which can mean 100 different things to 100 different people. And by the way, it's not just remote distributed. I've watched a lot of companies where if you have a value that is just like, oh, we do, compassion, and that means different things to all people on the ship. It doesn't matter if they're in the US or India or somewhere else. They don't get what that means unless they have a personal relationship to the CEO.
Right. Great answers. And this is a question primarily for Rich, but can you tell us why would businesses hire freelancers or work with digital nomads or any of the new style of workers?
I think there's quite a few reasons. One is we're seeing more and more new graduates come out where they don't want to work for a company. You've all read the studies about millennials, but if you go even earlier than that and see, I don't know if it's Gen Z or what they're named, there's a preference in employees where maybe 5 years ago, out of the side of their mouth, they say, I'm a freelancer. Now they're choosing to do this, and this is something where you're seeing the best talent. So if you're looking to have the best talent, that's certainly a strategy that you should think about. There's clearly advantages in flexibility and having a team that you can scale up and scale down if you need to, particularly if you're testing out new projects. And what we've seen, and coming back to the folklore story, like the longest tenured employees in our company are actually freelancers, and we celebrate that. We'll say we have someone who's been with us 10 years, and they happen to be a freelancer, and they happen to be in the Ukraine, and there's 5 of them. So I guess where I'm trying to take that is the loyalty that you see by enabling people to work in the lifestyle that they want and work on the projects that they want, it will pay off, and we've seen that across all sizes of companies.
Great. And I know Andela has a kind of unique model, so maybe you can share more about that.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Rich said. Developer statistics, Stack Overflow did a study. 12% of developers work remotely part-time at this point, and 12% work remotely full-time, and 30% work remotely either part-time or full-time. So employers are letting their workers do this. It makes you competitive if you allow the same. But I think that, to Richard's point, the biggest part is about the talent that you're able to attract if you look wider than your own backyard. Andela has been around for 2 years, not a very long time. In that time, we've had over 45,000 applicants to join our program, and we've accepted 250. And so the talent that we are working with is, I would say, unparalleled, really, at that scale. And we wouldn't be able to have worked with those people really anywhere else in the world, because outside of Africa, almost most other continents, there are already programs that are similar and that have captured that talent. And so by looking in Kenya and looking in Nigeria, we've unlocked this pool of talents. And for us, when we talk to companies, that is what we lead with, is you can work with the best person at a cost that's affordable to you and with a model that should work well with your current communication schedule.
Great. Thank you. And what are some of the risks of hiring freelancers and remote workers? Are there any? And is that good for the U.S. economy?
I think that if you aren't careful, you can silo your freelancers and not make them feel like they are part of a team. If you're not communicating on a regular basis, you could get work that is not what you expected. I think that I'm speaking very specifically about software engineers, and everyone here knows the difficulty of hiring software engineers, especially in Silicon Valley. But here, there's 5 job openings for every 1 developer on the market. So for us, that is actually one of the things that we looked at, is that there is a need for more people than this market can provide.
I think the key for us, and we've seen for most successful companies, is when you're managing a freelancer or somebody remote, is the need to be really precise in your communication and really think about the people that you put in charge of those remote teams. I like to try to hire choreographers so they're able to really look across the spectrum and be able to really project manage at a really high rate. There are the other risk, and I think kind of elephant in the room, is not all freelancers and not all people looking for work are great. We have 10,000 freelancers joining every day on Upwork, and not all of them are high enough qualifications to work with the companies in this room. Making sure that you clearly identify what skills you're needing, use some of the skill tests that are available and the references that you're able to see from the freelancers is going to get you probably 80% of the way there, and then modifying your own hiring practices and interview practices to make sure that you're hiring the right people for your culture who are going to be successful would be another tip that I'd give.
We have to make some investments in talent domestically. Like by 2020, there's supposed to be a 70% deficit of technical talent in the United States for all jobs. I don't even know what America looks like without 70% of the engineers and software developers that it needs. That's really scary. And I think I would push on the binary, do we invest in domestically or is it freelancers? I actually think there's a lot of room both to invest in domestic freelancers and to bring up the ranks and look at freelancers in a different way than we currently do. If the way that we treat freelance workers, whether that is your Lyft driver or if it's your software developer, is oh, you are expendable to me and you are good for this niche thing and that's all you are ever going to be good for, then you're going to watch a turnover rate in your talent across the board that is just going to cripple your company, right? And so we have to look at people as people and what are the strategic investments that you are making in them as they move across. And then I think we have to understand where we are then pigeonholing people in ways that do not give them mobility across because of the nature of being an underrepresented employee at the table. We're seeing a lot of a person of color will get into testing QA, and everyone has opinions on testing QA. They do not have the social capital to transition into other places in a company or to make the transition from a contractor into a full-time person. And those things, they aren't codified in any way that allows them to be empowered to make choices within a company. So they leave, right? And either they're leaving the industry or they are leaving the company. And we really can't afford right now for people to be leaving the industries at the rates that they are.
And I do want to open it up for questions from the audience. If you'd like to come to the mic, that would be great, so we can get that on the recording. And anyone can feel free to queue up if you have some burning questions. Go ahead.
I think you already asked this a little bit, but I'm curious from you guys, the kind of social contract of what we thought the relationship between companies and employees looked like is changed, no doubt about it. What is your vision for like, do you have an affirmative vision of what it looks like in the future? And right now it feels like we have a bit of a caste system happening. So I'm curious to hear each of you guys speak about that.
Yeah, I think it's the investment in talent and talent infrastructure across the board. It requires new skills than actually what we've used previously, and what does it look like to give enough clarity for people to know where they can move into, and enough supports around workforce development training for them to be able to make those moves. And that changes, like building those bridges between that caste system that you're talking about are really incredibly important at all. And that is going to be the challenge, I think, of workforce development for the next 20 years.
I think implicit in that question is there's a lot of benefits and social services for freelancers and contractors that aren't there right now in a safety net. And that clearly has to change. There are 55 million Americans in the U.S. who freelanced last year. And as that group grows and continues to grow, there are going to be changes in how the support systems are set up. I think the future really is starting with hybrid teams and then getting to where your company, everyone is a freelancer in terms of how you form teams and how both within your company and outside your company. I see a model where if I'm bidding for a project or I'm looking for work and I think CeCe is amazing at something, she and I can team up and look at and bid for a project, get a project, almost like the movie industry does, where we earn our reputation with a team and then break apart, disperse, and then come together with another team based on, and that's where I believe that, my kids are going, that's a world they're entering in, and I hope that they have both this support and safety net to allow them to do that, because I think that's a healthier look of the world.
I would term the trend in general that we're starting to see work be more flexible to life rather than the other way around. And you see a large number of workers, either freelancers or Uber drivers or TaskRabbits or people putting up their houses on Airbnb. You're putting your extra time or your extra resources to work to make money for you in a way that fits in your schedule. I think that we're going to see a continuation of that. And to Richard's point, then it's about building an infrastructure to support those people and to make sure that they are given the benefits and they are treated equally from that standpoint, but then also as a contributing member of the team.
Great. I think we have time for about 2 or 3 more questions, so why don't we get you?
Thank you three for being here. I have a question about implicit bias in the workplace, more specifically how examining our own implicit bias can be used as a lever for greater diversity and inclusion, and then even more specifically, if you have any tactics for how to do that on a larger scale.
One interesting thing that Andela tried that we do now is we actually took out the requirements for a resume when anyone applies to be an Andela developer. We realized that that was putting off a lot of people who actually were qualified and had the experience and the skills, but they saw the word resume and they immediately assumed that somehow their experience didn't match up to what they thought we wanted. We are also gender blind until the in-person interview, so that entire application process, the first part of it, we know very little about what that person looks like because it doesn't matter. Those are just 2 things that we've tried.
Our vision is certainly more of a meritocracy where, and we're seeing it right now, where skills are what pay the bills, and race, gender, where culture are not part of the hiring equation. We're clearly far from that, but by allowing companies to see and be exposed to great talent, we think that we're getting closer to that. I think you probably have a better answer on this one.
So one, I think it's really important to evaluate the places in which you have rested in a predominant culture and that understand that the risks involved for people in the non-predominant culture did not exist for you, and thus you may not know the totality of how to build for that. And so how do you start to create an analysis arc in different places in your organization that segment data through verticals that you've never segmented before, so that you are starting to understand where you are providing an experience differently for some people rather than others, whether that is an employee or a customer. And I think that those pieces are really important. And then the second thing that I'll say to that is, if you are looking at your operations and your systems and policies, and you come from a predominant culture in some way, shape, or form, and you're not getting feedback from cultures that are underrepresented and how they receive that and how that's looked at for them in a place that's safe enough for them to give feedback without repercussion, social repercussion, then you're not doing your job at building equitably.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question. So.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to go back to the point of the co-employment and contractors, and you guys are talking about including them in your team and all these things and making them feel welcome, and that's great. I mean, that's obviously what you want to do. I mean, the question I have is for the legal ramifications of that, because I've worked at a company that, you know, that hired thousands of freelancers, and it's very strict on like what you're allowed to include them in. And it's very strict on the operational instructions that you're allowed to give people like that. So I just found it very difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of the reasons why that we have a compliance offering, really the legal compliance that you're mentioning. And it's how we're able to serve companies like Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, Google, by maintaining that compliance. It is a little... It's a little more process than just going to Upwork.com, posting a job, and hiring somebody for those companies. Essentially, there's an evaluation of everyone who's hired and deciding whether they should be a 1099 or a W-2, and then in some cases, W-2 being for the employee, and in some cases, actually, Upwork will indemnify any employment risk as a result of that and take them on as an employer of record. So there is a solution for that specific use case that you're mentioning, and as we have 800 freelancers and are located in the U.S. and are under the scrutiny every day by a lot of the regulators that are looking at this issue pretty closely, we think we've developed a process that has made it tenable for larger companies to really tap into this amazing talent pool.
Terrific. All right, well, thank you very much. And if you guys could give a round of applause to our wonderful panel.